Hello, my name is Orlando Watts, and I'm the Associate Director of Tri-C Jazzfest. Now, regardless of your age, there's always a world of people and places who existed before you arrived. With that being said, I'm especially curious to learn about how jazz in Cleveland has evolved into the sound we all dig today. So follow me as we jump into jazz with three notable historians. Now, gentlemen, this is a very unique experience for me because we have three different perspectives. We have a jazz musician and educator, we have a jazz producer and event promoter, and a news personnel who covers all things jazz. So I'm curious to know about the scene in the 70s and 80s.
It wasn't just the late 70s, but it was the early 70s. In fact, the end of the 60s.
Oh.
Jazz at the end of the 60s was in a low ebb in terms of popularity. I can remember going to gigs and people coming up to me and saying, "You're not going to be playing any jazz, are you?"
Okay.
In the 70s, the Smiling Dog Saloon was the major jazz venue in Cleveland. That was the place to go.
Yeah, but when the Smiling Dog closed, there was virtually nothing going on in Cleveland. But certainly no touring acts until Dewey Ford opened Peabody's Cafe in Cleveland Heights. Jazz was at a very low ebb at the end of the 70s. And I think four things happened together. The Northeast Ohio Jazz Society was formed, promoted a lot of local jazz, brought in a lot of national acts. Tri-C Jazzfest was born in 1980, created a lot of interest in Cleveland. The Cleveland Jazz Orchestra was formed in 1984.
Okay.
And brought back more interest in big band jazz. And just a few months after that, WCPN radio signed on the air. And in those days, they were playing 80 hours a week of jazz on radio. So all these things, I think, came together to kick off a resurgence of jazz in Cleveland.
We've identified definitive pillars that help to reestablish jazz as a prominent pastime in Cleveland. Now let's explore where these pillars supported the sound throughout the city.
So let's talk a little bit about places to play, such as Nighttown.
Well, Nighttown continues to play a large role in the scene. At first, my recollection was back in the 1960s. It was just this narrow room, but it was kind of a very intimate experience.
It was very quiet in the late 70s, except perhaps for the Peabody's Cafe.
Right, that kind of snuck in.
And they ran touring acts only about once a month. It was guys like you were playing there, and Jamie Haddad, and Neil Creaky, and playing Sunday nights.
Yeah, Peabody's was the major place that we played. However, there were we started playing all these other clubs that you wouldn't actually call jazz clubs.
Well, even Peabody's was not exclusively jazz by any means.
No, they weren't. There were clubs that were performance clubs where they wanted to hear you. And then there were clubs that were background music clubs that basically didn't want you to bother anybody. Boarding House was like that, and so was Isabella's. Great musicians played these clubs, right? But you had to wait till the last set, till all the talkers left, before you could actually hear some stuff. I remember Duke Jenkins Trio playing constantly. Dewey Jeffries always working. I mentioned the Sky High Trio. They played the Boarding House besides Angelo's. They played all over town.
Don't forget about Carl East Carter, tremendous piano player.
Carl played the Boarding House. Was a great player. Yeah. Great. I mean, it's just a tremendous player. So was Bill Gidney.
Yeah.
See, some of these clubs, actually like the Native Son, they were known for jazz artists.
They didn't do jazz nightly, but they had a heck of a matinee set on Saturday. That was very popular. As a matter of fact, WCPN broadcast live from there one Saturday, and it was a blast.
Yeah, it was a club associated with jazz, as was the Lancers.
Sure. Well, Lancers.
They wanted you to play.
Yeah, Lancers. That club has been around a long time. Okay. A long time. And I remember when Evelyn Wright was doing Fridays, there. It was pretty darn special, for a long time. In the African American community, in the inner city, there were clubs like the Native Son, Sarah House, and my book, Jazz Keepers, pays tribute to the local musicians basically in the inner city. And I think they're very important in keeping the music alive throughout the whole community.
So let's talk about the Bop Stop.
For Cleveland musicians, the Bop Stop has been a journey.
In 1991, Ron Bush, a vibraphonist, had a dream of a listening room for jazz. And he rented a little corner bar at East 40th and St. Clair and called it the Bop Stop. And very quickly, most of the best musicians in town, you're included, I'm sure.
Well, we love the room. We love playing there.
You were there early on with a lot of great players, and they planned and built this building exclusively for jazz. It was intended for nothing but jazz. It was named the #1 jazz club in the country.
Wow.
It's an amazing story.
It's clear that Cleveland constructed a few vibrant venues that provided adequate platforms for world-class jazz, happening just around the corner.
I wonder what you guys think about how the launching of Jazzfest affected jazz in Cleveland.
Tri-C Jazzfest became pretty quickly the nation's largest educational jazz festival. You started playing more concerts at high schools, doing clinics. So all this stuff is starting to happen.
Also, Jazzfest was very important to the public library, especially East Cleveland Public Library, because I had my own jazz series in place. And fortunately, I was able to collaborate with Tri-C Jazzfest and feature national stars.
So it's been a long-standing relationship.
I've been working with that relationship 30 years.
Gotcha.
Yeah, it's been great.
So what would you say about the future of jazz in Cleveland? Is it even still relevant? Is it still alive?
It's very much alive. It's not alive in the same way that it was, but it is still, part of what is going on here.
To me, it's almost a classical music that's going to live forever. The music itself is one of the few, if not the only, American art forms.
Jazz is something that is part of the moment, the people you're playing with, who you're playing for, in the space that you're playing in.
I think it's safe to say that although jazz in Cleveland has in fact taken on various shapes and even new faces, the craft is still alive and well.
There's no doubt that Tri-C has been central to the vitality of jazz in Cleveland. We've been right here since 1980, presenting world-class concerts, introducing students to jazz, and sending future musicians into the world. Because jazz lives here.